Hi, welcome to this short briefing about the use of thrust reversers. Thrust reversers are one of the ways to decelerate the aircraft. In this briefing, we will see how to correctly use them. First, let's focus on the use of reversers in the landing SOPs. By design, thrust reversers perform better at high speed. Therefore, the flight crew must select reverse thrust immediately after main landing gear touchdown. It's very important to select all reversers at the same time and symmetrically in order to avoid any directional control issues. Remember that as soon as thrust reversers are selected, the flight crew must perform a full stop landing. As soon as the engine display shows the green rev indications for all engines, as per standard callouts, the PM calls reverse green. At lower speeds, the performance of rev max is reduced and there is a risk of engine stall. Therefore, on most aircraft, when the speed reaches 70 knots on the PFD speed scale, the PM calls 70 knots. The PF calls checked and reduces reverse thrust to rev idle. The thrust reversers to rev idle must be maintained until taxi speed in order to be able to quickly apply rev max if needed. At taxi speed, the use of thrust reversers can lead to the ingestion of foreign objects such as sand or dust. Therefore, at taxi speed, stow all thrust reversers before leaving the runway. During taxi, do not use reversers, even rev idle, to control speed, except in the case of loss of braking. Pay attention to the fact that there are small differences between aircraft types. The speed that the PM calls out changes depending on aircraft types. 60 knot for A340-500 and 600, 80 knot for A300 and A310. And on A300, A310 and A340, the reversers are deployed in two steps. Rev idle at touchdown, rev max only when the PM calls out reverse green. Now, let's look at the complete landing procedure.
Spoilers, reverse green, diesel. $70 knots. Check.
Rev max or rev idle. During the landing roll, the flight crew can use rev max or rev idle. The flight crew should speak about this during the briefing. Let's see some examples. Use of rev idle. Some airports recommend rev idle in order to limit noise. Rev idle may also be used for fuel saving. The selection of rev idle or rev max depends on the runway and the weather conditions. Therefore, the flight crew must check landing performance based on the expected weather and the associated runway state. Rev idle is possible on a dry runway. Rev idle is also possible on a wet runway. But as part of threat and error management, one of the possible threats when landing on a wet runway is a runway reported wet that is in fact worse than wet. This is because during active precipitation or shortly afterwards, the water depth is variable and therefore difficult to report accurately. To mitigate this, the flight crew must check landing performance in the conditions described in the SOP descent preparation and select the landing performance level medium to poor. This also corresponds to landing performance code 2. Use of RevMax. The flight crew must select RevMax if the runway is contaminated. But, as part of threat and error management, one of the possible threats is high crosswind. If you land with a residual crab angle and allow the aircraft to weathercock into the wind, thrust reversers create a side force that will be combined with the crosswind lateral component. As a result, your aircraft will drift to the downwind side of the runway. In addition, the reversers disturb the airflow around the rudder, which decreases its performance. Therefore, to mitigate lateral control problems during rollout, reduce reverse thrust to rev idle. When back to the runway centerline, you can apply reverse thrust again as required. For more details on crosswind landing, I invite you to watch the wind video Preventing Runway Excursion, the crosswind landing technique. The flight crew must also select RevMax in the case of an emergency, rejected takeoff, loss of braking. Contrary to the standard conditions, in the case of an emergency, you can keep RevMax until the aircraft stops. In addition, the flight crew must select RevMax if the deceleration is not as expected, a failure affects landing performance, a long flare or a long touchdown occurs, or if there is an unexpected tailwind. Specific cases. Now let's look at some specific situations. If the aircraft is operated under MEL with one deactivated reverser, you must use all reverser control levers. When the green rev indication is displayed for the operative engine, the PM calls out reverse green. It's not necessary to call out no reverse engine X because the flight crew should have discussed the situation during the briefing. Therefore, the flight crew previously knows that one reverser will not deploy. The callout no reverse engine X or no reverse is used only if the reverse deployment is not as expected. For more information, you can watch the wind video What About Deceleration Means at Landing. If there is ash, sand or dust as part of threat and error management, one of the possible threats is that the reverser airflow may steer the ash, sand or dust and reduce visibility. Therefore, limit the use of thrust reversers as much as possible. During touch and go, do not use reverse thrust. If the trainee selects reverse thrust, the flight crew must perform a full stop landing. For more information, I invite you to watch the wind video What About Touch and Go. As a conclusion, it's important to ensure that your pilots know the SOPs for thrust reversers, procedures, standard callouts as described in the FCOM and FCTM. Pay attention to the conditions in which you can or cannot use rev idle. In any case, remember that in an emergency, RevMax must be used until the aircraft stops if necessary. I hope that you enjoyed this briefing and I'll see you around for the next one.